Welcome to everyone. My name's Susan Howard. I run the events department at AJR. If you aren't familiar with AJR, the Association of Jewish Refugees is a UK-based charity that works with Holocaust survivors. I'm delighted to welcome you to this event this evening, and I'm delighted to welcome Professor John J. Hartfield and Monica Baum-Duchen, who will be in conversation with him. And Monica, it's my pleasure to hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. Yes, well, as I have sort of two hats for justifying my presence today. One is as an art historian with a very long-standing and deep interest in German visual culture and art, particularly art of the early 20th century, and relating to the rise of Nazism and indeed the protest against it, but also as the founding director of a project called Insiders Outsiders, which pays homage to those refugees from Nazi Europe who found sanctuary in this country. And as you may or may not already be aware, John Hartfield was one such, very much so. It's my very, very great pleasure and honor to welcome his grandson, Professor John J. Hartfield, to introduce us to his remarkable grandfather. John is a composer, a writer, and for our purposes today, above all, the curator of the really rich and informative and fascinating John Hartfield, the official website. So I think without further ado, John, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Monica, and thank you all for joining me today. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Karen Diamond and Susan Howard and Deborah Barnes for bringing us all together. Also, my good friend Andrea Hoffman for her knowledge and insights into my grandfather's work. Andrea has written several outstanding commentaries available on the John Hartfield exhibition website. John Hartfield lived and worked in Berlin until the night of Easter Sunday, April 14th, 1933. When Hitler's SS kicked in the door of his studio, he jumped through the doors of his French windows, he landed badly, and he survived by hiding in a trash can in an alley. The SS, probably unable to believe a man could be short and thin and humble enough to hide in a trash bin, and gave up searching for him, but they ripped apart his studio and they destroyed all the work that they could find. My grandfather was German, but Germany had become enemy territory. He was now a wanted man and forced to become a refugee. His only crime was his willingness to use his wit and considerable artistic talent to publicly push back against fascist and Nazi propaganda. And it had been less than 1 month since the enabling bill gave Adolf Hitler complete control of Germany, despite the fact that his party, using voter suppression and violence, received only 43.9% of the vote in the March 5th federal election. With the help of supporters, many in the Jewish community, he escaped Berlin. He walked across the Sudeten Mountains to Czechoslovakia and then to Prague. From 1930 to 1938, John Hartfield produced a staggering total of 240 full-page photomontages for the AIZ magazine covers. They were blow-by-blow response and a permanent record of the fascist agenda. When the Nazis invaded Czechoslovakia in 1938, John Hartfield was near the top of the Gestapo's most wanted list. He remained high on the Gestapo's radar and their list while he was a refugee in England. In 1938, he officially became a refugee when his German citizenship was annulled. The official reason was he was Jewish. When he was attacked by Nazi propagandists, they claimed only a man with prototype ugly Jewish features could possibly produce images of such ugliness. These are two of the AIZ covers that my grandfather produced. On the left, you'll see "Millions stand behind me," the meaning of the Hitler salute. A small man asked for big gifts. And on the right, you'll see a tool in Fritz Tyson's hand. If you were walking down a major Berlin street, such as the Friedrichstrasse, and came upon a corner newsstand, one of John Hartfield's photomontages would appear right there on the cover of one of Germany's most popular illustrated magazines, the AIZ. Now, one thing, I'm going to talk more about the Tyson cover in a minute, but one thing I would immediately want you to notice that my grandfather did not distort the features of the persons that he mocked. Instead, he used proportion, and always, or almost always, he made Hitler much smaller in relationship to the other elements in the image. For example, on the left, you can see that Hitler's head is much smaller than the money on top of it, and on the right, Hitler's just a small puppet in relation to the other elements. Now, the AIZ went from a popular magazine and publication to an outlawed publication. It was published from 1924 to 1938. In 1933, it was outlawed because freedom of opinion and choice, as you all know, is fascism's most hated enemy. Willy Munsenberg was the left-wing publisher of the AIZ. He came from a Jewish family, and Willy was instrumental in making John Hartfield's art famous. The magazine was also left-wing, however, it was not an organ of any political party, not officially affiliated with any party. And sadly, Willy's death by strangulation in France in 1940 remains a mystery. Now, on your left is the art that John Hartfield created using only tools like scissors and paste. And on the right is the AIZ cover with Hartfield's caption. Although John Hartfield was a perfectionist, he responded to words and events with incredible speed, and you'll see that in a moment. When Wilhelm Kube, a notorious German Christian leader and a zealous Nazi, proclaimed that Hitler was a tool in God's hands, my grandfather quickly responded, no, Hitler was a toy in Tyson's hand. Now, consider just part of John Hartfield's process. First, his reaction. Then he had to conceive a response. Then he had to choose the materials. Then there was the painstaking creation of a collage with scissors and paste, retouching again, rotogravure. And rotogravure was how the images were reproduced, just like you'll find that you're in the rotogravure. Final checks, and then publication. Yet it was only a short time between an event and my grandfather's response. Rather than distorting Hitler's photos, my grandfather dressed him in a puppet-like military uniform, small shiny boots, and petulant arms, controlled with a string protruding from his bottom. In his right hand, he waves a sword, and in his left, he holds and clutches on to a sack of cash. It's the first clue that the puppet's military nature is directly tied to finance. On the left, we see the prominent figure of Fritz Tyson, and that actually is Fritz Tyson. Tyson was a wealthy German steel magnate and essential financial supporter of Adolf Hitler. Tyson's support was essential for Hitler's rise to power. After the war, courts classified Tyson as a, quote, minor Nazi. He paid a trivial fine and went on to live a comfortable life. Now, what John Hartfield did was he did increase the size of Tyson's head, forcing his steely gaze to raise not on what the financier found most interesting. Tyson wasn't interested in the toy Hitler, but Tyson's hand that was pulling the strings. My grandfather darkened Tyson's lips and added a huge torpedo cigar. That cigar was favored by the rich and was considered a symbol of upper-class greed. Charlie Chaplin brilliantly used cigars, and Hartfield was a huge Charlie Chaplin fan. The torpedo cigar is a metaphor for German rearmament. Hartfield also made two small additions to Tyson's tie, a swastika, and directly above it is a pin that appears to form a cross. Remember, it was a Christian leader who said the words that are mocked in my grandfather's caption. So the addition of a pin can be seen as a subliminal content on a false Christianity. It's 1933, and Hitler will be Times Man of the Year. And American manufacturers adore him. And soon he'll negotiate peace in our time. But in one visual jolt, by pairing the puppet and the puppet master, Hartfield makes it clear it's all a big lie. Hitler and his business allies always wanted one thing: war. Taken together, the elements in this montage scream, Tyson wants a war, and Hitler will dance for him. My grandfather loved American cartoons. Nods to cartoons appeared in some of his work. But his art provided him with at least two things that film could not: mass exposure outside the confines of a darkened theater, and a single visual jolt to the senses. If you remember, I spoke about walking towards this cover on a Berlin street. Now, as you bounce along in the street, can't you just see that angry little toy megalomaniac jumping up and down in Tyson's conniving grasp? Also, agree or disagree, a person might think, this fellow, John Heartfield, he's asking for it. And you'd be right. Brown shirts kicked in his teeth and threw him from a streetcar. He had the kind of talent and training that would have given him a comfortable life inside or outside Germany. So why did he do it? John Hartfield was born in 1891 with the name Helmut Herzfeld. His father, Franz, was a firebrand socialist writer and poet. His mother, Alice, was a textile worker and political activist organizer. Franz came from a wealthy Jewish family, but his outgoing nature often landed him in trouble, forcing his family to move frequently. My grandfather was their first child. They had 3 more children before Franz, Alice, and their 4 children settled in an isolated cabin in the Eigen Woods. Although it's unclear why it happened, it's clear what happened next. One night, Franz is no longer there. And shortly afterwards, Alice, without a word, is also gone. My grandfather was 8 years old. It was 1899. His brother Wieland later wrote that my grandfather, heartbroken, searched the woods in vain for days, calling again and again for his mother. Finally, Ignaz Raschan, the mayor of Eigen, took in the children. My grandfather spent most of his days in the woods, eating berries and talking to animals. Uncle Ignaz, as he was known, finds that it's all too much, and he sends the boy to a Catholic nunnery where the nuns beat him for his rebellious notions. His brother Wieland wrote this description of my grandfather. He takes big steps, and he's never calm. His appearance is sad and grotesque. He is high-spirited and violently tempered, but never profane. His intellect is average, but he projects a critical feeling of strength, confidence, clarity, and sensitivity with every movement, glance, and position. We all dream to grow up to be something when we're young. My grandfather wanted to be an artist. At first, he used oils to paint landscapes, but he became fascinated with advertising and understood its power. Advertising was always a form of propaganda, and World War I weaponized it. I believe he learned 2 lessons from his childhood, and they formed his core beliefs. Unconditional love was for animals, not authority figures. In 1960, he said, I was never a functionary. He hated injustice. His brother Wieland wrote, my grandfather responded to all injustice as if it was a personal attack. And since he was a lifelong pacifist, my grandfather responded to injustice not with calls for violence, but with art as a weapon. Art with clarity and wit to expose the, quote, fake reality of propaganda that justified leader worship and injustice. After my grandfather visited the German front, he was drafted into the Kaiser Wilhelm Regiment. His hatred of violence would not allow him to contribute to the senseless horror of trench warfare, so he faked a nervous breakdown in front of his regiment. When an officer made fun of him, his all-too-real reaction landed him in a mental hospital. Now, after he's released, the military assigns him to a propaganda unit. A revealing episode is when he's ordered to distribute propaganda leaflets. He strolls around the corner and he throws all of them into a storm drain. In the trenches on both sides of World War I, bullets are a minor issue. More soldiers die from disease. In no man's land, they drown in billions of shell holes or choke on mustard gas and weaponized chlorine. World War I led to the prohibition of chemical weapons. Fritz Haber, the German chemist, was known as the father of chemical warfare and received the 1918 Nobel Prize for Chemistry. Haber's work led to the invention of Zyklon gas. Now, let's take a moment to define propaganda. The crucial phrase in Lasswell's definition, his classic definition, is its opinions or actions carried out deliberately by individuals. Now, I would add that if propaganda has no basis in fact, it usually has the goal of convincing an individual or a group that something horrible is actually desirable. In World War I, German civilians knew very little about what was happening at the front. Propaganda convinced many German civilians something terrible was desirable. Your husbands and sons, they were heroes, happily fighting a noble war for country and glory. In 1916, crowds in the Berlin streets shouted, God strafe England, or God punish England, and my grandfather, Helmut Heartfield, could not stomach this blind loyalty and this out-of-control nationalism. So to protest, he decided he would be known by an English version of his name, John Hartfield. Millions of pieces of correspondence were sent to the front every day, and several millions were posted in return. Well over half of this correspondence was postcard, making it easy for censors to check the mail. George Gross and John Hartfield began pasting images on postcards to get past the German censors, and they were delighted that people paid to have these postcards sent to the front. Because of his training in advertising, John Hartfield knew what was powerful about transposition. And he knew that two contrasting images placed in proximity to each other could create an entirely new message. After World War I, Germany experienced kind of a nervous breakdown. The Great War, though it was senseless, helped technology grow at an incredible speed. Industrial noise and movement, motor cars and radios assaulted Berlin society. As the city became one of the cosmopolitan cultural centers of Europe, there were violent urban clashes, schizophrenic political thinking, and libertine abandon. Crowds gathered in plazas or beer halls to listen to anyone who shouted from a soapbox. Social controls melted away, the old norms broke down, the economy mirrored America's stock market boom and would deeply feel our 1929 crash. And there was an explosion of art, politics, and revolution. You look anywhere and you'd see cocaine addicts and streetwalkers, sadists and nonsense and battered taxi drivers and beggars in the Alexanderplatz. The city had pretty much gone insane. Into this insanity strides the Dada artists. In 1915, John Hartfield met George Gross. Gross was a genius and a dandy who might wear white makeup, lipstick, and impeccably starched white suits. He told my grandfather, "You're a clever fellow. That art hanging in museums, that's just a distraction from the war. If you want a picture of a flower or a person, well, take a photograph." Dada came to Berlin from Switzerland in 1918. And Dada artists didn't seek to reproduce the everyday world. Dada was revolutionary art that aimed to make a statement. And the Dadaists, they were cocaine and alcohol-fueled rebels who disrupted poetry readings to shake up the bourgeoisie. My grandfather heard Gross, and then he threw all his oil paintings onto a fire, except the one on the left. Why? Well, suddenly the one on the left became art on the right. This is Johnny's Land by George Gross and John Hartfield. On the upper left, you see a general who is tilted to the left. And above his head, you see what? Oh, there's a torpedo cigar. And on the right, you see a Madonna, and she's tilting towards something up above her on the right, and that's Dada. And every single piece of this work of art was carefully chosen and carefully placed. Now, my grandfather had a remarkable visual memory. He studied many art forms and was never shy about repurposing his own work for others. Now, I can quickly prove that statement that my grandfather had a visual memory with this one image. Remind you of anything? This is Life and Times in Universal City. It has film strips, photoplays, earpieces, and multiple references to exploding technology. Together, these elements compress the multiple frames of a film montage into one complex, masterful collage. According to a doctor in Vienna who proposed some radical new theories, cocaine is therapeutic. And Dada artists had wild cocaine and alcohol-fueled parties. And at the height of these parties, they tied their good friend and comrade John Hartfield to a chair, and then they taunted him, and then they poked him with sticks. They wanted to experience the height of emotion. They wanted to see how angry can one human being become. In 1920, my grandfather was the organizer of the first International Dada Fair at Art of Bouchard's Gallery in Berlin. You can see Raoul Hausmann, Anna Hawk, one of my favorite artists, Anna Hawk, Kurt Schwitters, George Gross, and John Hartfield on your right. Hartfield and Rudolf Schlichter hung a sculpture, Prussian Archangel, from the ceiling that depicted a pig in a German military uniform. As you can imagine, this caused quite a sensation in certain quarters. Now, the first International Dada Fair was the last International Dada Fair. A ship carrying much of the show's art to an American exhibition sank to the bottom of the ocean. And Dadaists thought that fishes were perhaps the most appreciative audience of their era. However, from Picasso to John Lennon to David Bowie, Dada remains entrenched in our culture. From 1920 to 1929, John Hartfield produced graphic designs for book jackets and interiors for the publishing house Malik Verlag. His partner, his brother Wieland, ran the business end. While illustrating books by authors such as Upton Sinclair and Sinclair Lewis, my grandfather further developed his technique. Skyscrapers might rise from enormous waves, as they did in a Mutt and Jeff cartoon. Now, John Hartfield became a fixture in Berlin advertising. People thought Malik Verlag book covers were amazing, and they bought them just to own his graphic design. They didn't even, in many cases, didn't even read the book. They just bought them for the covers. The largest Berlin advertising agencies offered him extremely well-paid positions, but he turned them all down. He had to be free to express himself on his own terms. Hartfield introduced custom typography that was a seamless element of the graphic design. In the upper right of the cover, you see the author's name, Michael Gold, and that's custom typography, and there's many examples of that in his work. He also pioneered storytelling from the front cover of the book to the spine and then to the back. The story of poverty and despair starts on the front cover. The next chapter appears on the spine, and then a child looks at what may be a hopeless future. The visual story becomes an unbroken circle from childhood to old age. The title of this book is Jews Without Gold. Hartfield's cover, powerful in its reality, is a response to the Nazi talking point that Jews use their vast financial resources to undermine Germany's greatness. John Hartfield designed this political poster for the German Communist Party, the KPD, for the 1928 federal election. This simple photo is one of the most memorable political symbols in history. What is more powerful than the five fingers of the human hand working together? Hartfield produced this work by standing in front of a factory with a photographer and shouted, "Hold up your hand," as workers left. He carried hundreds of photos to his studio, and he chose this one. The image endures as worldwide as music covers and Guatemalan tattoos. By the way, you probably know that in the 1928 election, Hitler's NSDAP party, which started out as something of a joke, received only 12% of the vote. Of course, that was prior to the 1929 U.S. stock market crash. This is John Hartfield's self-portrait for the 1929 Film and Photo Exhibition in Stuttgart. He's slicing through the mouth of a placid Karl Zorgiebel, the ruling party's brutal SPD commissioner. Zorgiebel ordered his men to fire on a parade. They killed 32 people, mostly innocent bystanders. Now, like a barber cutting off hair, Hartfield cuts off Zorbiegel's ability to spread his hate. He pulls his head back gently, and the artist's intense gaze and his hand on the subject's head says, I'm in control here. My grandfather he was 5'2", and he weighed 100 pounds, soaking wet. And notwithstanding his pacifist principles, he couldn't defend himself when he was attacked in the street. However, he could occasionally escape to the cinema he loved. And one night, the face of this police commissioner, Beagle, appeared in a newsreel. My grandfather jumped up and he shouted at the screen, "You are a swine." A large, well-muscled Teutonic supporter of the SPD and the commissioner, 2 rows behind him, shouted at my grandfather to apologize. My grandfather turned to the man and he shouted, "You are a swine." And when the newsreel was over, the man knocked my grandfather to the floor and repeatedly punched him again and again in the face. And with every blow to my grandfather's face, the man said, "You will apologize." And my grandfather, laying there, the pacifist he was, looked up at the man and he said, "You are a swine." And that is my grandfather from my collection in 1948. In 1916, John Hartfield created a graphic with the text, "Advertising becomes art and science when it's produced with the ethical means of truth." Surrounded by lies, conspiracies, and imagined racial superiority, Hartfield's photomontages reflected what was real. He could manipulate elements in his work to reveal reality easily just by, cutting a photograph and pasting it onto a piece of paper. In 1932, for example, Hartfield superimposed a belly full of coins on an actual photograph of Adolf Hitler, who was shouting at a rally, and added the caption, "Adolf, the Superman, swallows gold and spits junk." And just as often, of course, that also appeared on the street because a count liked that one so much, and you can see it on the John Hartfield exhibition, that he made a poster of it and he had it plastered all over Berlin. Now, just as often, my grandfather would demand that the elements in his art conformed to reality. For example, his photographer, who made many, many photographs for him, Janos Riesman, one day they went out to take a photograph of a crab. And my grandfather wanted the crab's claws and its mustache to be in a certain position. And they tried to put it in that position, and the crab moved. And then my grandfather, a little frustrated, got down on his hands and knees and tried to hypnotize the crab so that the crab would do what he wanted. But of course, the crab was stubborn. And after quite a few hours of this, Janos Riesman finally said, "Let's kill the crab. And then you can put the crab claws and the crab mustache where you want." My grandfather was outraged. He said, no. Then it would look like a dead crab. It would not look like a live crab. On the left, he submerged an assistant in a huge barrel of Goebbels' healing mustard. And he ignored pleas to use marmalade or chocolate syrup rather than the vinegary stuff, because he knew that false materials would make the outcome false. Now, this is Nazi art in the Holocaust Museum in Russia. This is Nazi art, and it is art without a soul. It's a most excellent argument that freedom of thought, expression, and choice are the sworn enemies of fascism. In 1924, Adolf Hitler wrote, "Propaganda is a truly terrible weapon in the hands of an expert." Although they lacked widespread social media and compliant cable networks, the Nazi propaganda machine swayed millions with promises of German greatness and ugly fantasies of enemies to Germany. In Prague, while he was working, my grandfather kept a pet turtle in his pocket so that neither of them would be lonely. In England, his friend, Fred Ullman, also a refugee, suffered internment, and he allowed my grandfather to stay rent-free at his house in Hampstead for 4 years. Fred's daughter, Carolyn Compton, told me this story. Fred Ullman gave Johnny some rabbits for food during the wartime shortages, but my grandfather had to kill them first, and he couldn't do it. My grandfather and his wife, Tootie, were living in Highgate, and Johnny would go for walks on the Hampstead Heath, and he collected food for the rabbits. And of course, the rabbits were a joy to his landlord, and also they got free on a streetcar one time. Once again, even with an enduring love for animals and nature, John Hartfield demanded the truth, so a real dog was placed on a bayonet at the center of this work. This is a work of art that cries that war destroys everything gentle and beautiful. In 1934, Janos Riesman, Hartfield's photographer, wrote, "Hartfield's work is a struggle, repeated day after day to realize his ideas and aims. The brilliant Jewish artist Hellebuth modeled for this masterpiece the executioner and justice." And on your right, you see Lady Justice, Justicia, I believe that's the Lady Justice, that's in the Arkansas State House. And on the left, you see my grandfather's art. You can see that on the left, the sword, which is dripping blood, is held higher than the scales. Justice is not blind, but it's beaten, broken, blinded. And the scales of justice are held with missing fingers. She's not freely able to move in a flowing gown, but she's tightly bound. She's not a powerful standing figure, but she needs to sit because of weariness and mistreatment. And there's so much more. I saw an offensive cartoon on November 24, 2015, showing Syrian refugees crossing into Europe, bringing rats with them. And further down the page was a Nazi cartoon depicting Jews as rats being wiped from Germany's doorstep. I thought immediately of my grandfather's 1934 photomontage conversation in the Berlin Zoo. Now here's a translated dialogue from John Hartfield's caption. The striker, who's a known Nazi, writes that Jews are animals, and so on. Will they soon be locked up in the zoo? And the wise Marabu responds, "Pooh, they are to be placed on church spires. That's much cleverer." And the monkey says, explain to me, why? And the Marabu says, well, Jews are the best lightning conductors. Now, this montage brilliantly illustrates how politicians use refugees and, quote, the other as lightning rods to excite their supporters. This is not a painting, but it is a stunning work of art, created with the simplest of tools, under the harshest of conditions. Just scissors, paste, courage. There's documentation that my grandfather wanted to join my family in New York. To have him with us would have been amazing and would have changed my life so much for the better. He also wrote to the Czech Refugee Fund, begging to stay in England near the British Museum for his health and work. Appeals to democracies were denied. Hartfield's brother Wieland found him a place in East Germany where he narrowly avoided a treason trial because of his friends and the fact that his dentist was under suspicion by the Stasi. He was denied benefits and admission to the Akademie der Kunst for 6 years, receiving subpar health care when he suffered heart attacks. His warning should appear in museums worldwide. I think there should be a Hartfield house in Berlin, where his art would remain an effective weapon to remind us of the consequences of unconditional fealty to a leader who espoused racism and xenophobia and intolerance. Instead, an East German archive absorbed his art and later melded with the German ADK. For decades, and even to a great extent today, my grandfather's art gathers dust in the name of conservation. I once showed one of my neighbors the montage on my iPhone out of the Superman, swallows gold and spouts junk. And she looked at it and she said, "Your grandfather did that?" I said, "Yes." That's amazing. My parents were in Germany and they managed to get out just in time. I wonder if they saw that art and it meant something to them. Thank you.